In 2007, Gary received the Maxwell E. Perkins Award for discovering, nurturing, and championing writers of fiction. The award is named for the legendary editor of Fitzgerald, Hemingway, and Thomas Wolfe. As Knopf's vice president and editor-at-large, Fisketjohn has a stable of equally impressive authors, including Tobias Wolff, Julian Barnes, Cormac McCarthy, Gore Vidal, Raymond Carver, and Peter Carey. Richard Ford, whose 6 books with Fisketjohn include the Pulitzer Prize-winning Independence Day, gave the following remarks at the award banquet. At heart, Gary believes books belong to and get written only by their authors. He is not here to write for any of us, and while that division of labors may seem obvious and simple-minded to observe, it can become tricky when an editor is giving his precious life's days and weeks and months to make a book better, and yet must not take the book over. This precarious distinction, which Gary observes and treads with greater force and art than even I know, makes me never say that Gary Fisketjohn is my editor, but rather that he is the man I'm fortunate enough to edit my books with. It was as managing editor of Vintage Contemporaries that Gary decided to publish original work in paperback and mix it with reprints of established literary authors. Among the novels published under this scheme were Ford's The Sports Writer and Bright Light's Big City by his Williams classmate and lifelong friend, Jay McInerney.
I just asked Mark, if you can hear me, who Brady Udall is to him, and he would be a nephew?
He's a cousin.
Cousin.
All Udalls are related, for better or for worse.
But about, I should think, 10 years ago, I met a very talented young writer called Brady Udall. He ended up being published elsewhere, although one part of our company publishes him today, but I figured there had to be a connection. At any rate, it's a terrific honor to be here, even with a crippling sense of the imposter syndrome, as previously spoke, but we'll get over that. And I felt really the same kind of privilege when I turned up here in '74. I'd had 2 years of a fairly interesting on and off campus education in San Francisco at a pretty interesting time in our lives, and came back here and was shocked to see that not everybody had hair down way down their back. Everybody was wearing Izod sports shirts, and in San Francisco, though I had the long hair and a bunch of other things going on, I also played golf, and I alone wore the little alligators on my shirts, and everybody thought there that this was hilarious, as opposed to customary. And kind of like Mark, I'd grown up in Oregon, and that was thought to be a very unusual place to come from when I turned up. But I found somebody else who grew up in California, so we kind of had a little common cause. But I arrived kind of green as could be, but with a great curiosity, as I think everybody who turns up at Williams does have. And that was soon really directed on and focused on literature. And I had the stupendous good fortune to be here in Don Gifford's time, and he's one of the most important people in my life, and continued to be for a great long time after I graduated. There were other standouts. Clay Hunt was infamous, notorious, but a first-class mind. But with Don, I think I learned how to have more than an infatuation with literature, but to see it clearly and see it honestly and all the rest of it. Some 10 years after I graduated, I was lucky enough to actually publish a book of gifts called The Farther Shore, so that for once I got to grade the paper. Which I took a certain sadistic glee in, but he had taught me well enough not to indulge that. But I would think much of what I've ever accomplished in my life is all due to Giff and to Nora, and I wish that they were here today, obviously. Now, having had these various infatuations, literature, philosophy, history, of course, I was pretty much unemployable when I graduated. And this was driven home when I applied to a half a dozen graduate programs, and 2 or 3 let me in. And Those two or three pointed out that when I picked up my doctorate in 4 years, I corrected that to 6 immediately, they wouldn't be able to put me in a job that I would ever wish to have. So maybe I'm 22 years old or something like that, unemployable, looking at being 30, and really completely unemployable. So I said, God, what in the heck can you do now? So I ran off to Alaska, where I'd lived before, and that was good for a little while. But graduate school was becoming less and less appealing. And I remember 2 classmates of mine from the class of 76 had gone on to a publishing course that was started at Radcliffe, I think in 1950. The first of these. There are several of these programs now, but this was the first one. And I thought, well, that's weird, because never once when I was a student here, and working on the literary magazine, working, friends with like-minded people, everybody writing bad poems, bad stories, bad whatever. No one in my undergraduate life ever said, well, gosh, what about publishing as a thing to do? One thing that anybody who graduates from Williams does know how to do is read, with some discrimination. But strangely, it never had occurred to me until I remembered this weird development 2 friends of mine had undertaken, and drifted into publishing. I went to that program. I could have as easily gone to stay with these friends who had jobs in New York and learned without paying my last $5,000 to Radcliffe. But it was a good time to be drifting into publishing for 2 reasons. One, it was a dying business at that time. It was kind of wallowing in inefficiencies, not directing the interest of readers to new, serious, good writers, but really kind of living off the handful that were doing all right, and then commercial writers who are entertaining but ultimately not terribly worthwhile. The second good reason was that, my first job was in 1977, young people had not been graduating from college and going to New York kind of for any reason. I mean, they were going in the opposite direction. They were going to live in an orchard someplace, or a commune, or somewhere far away from the military-industrial complex. Mind you, the war has been long over by now, but even so, it was a happy business to walk into when everybody who was running these companies was about my age, and they suddenly realized it. We need to get some not old people around here. And suddenly a few of them are turning up. I happened to be one, and I said, I'm not old yet. And they said, you need a haircut. And I eventually could afford one. But it was interesting to see a business on a cusp of change, and a lot of things, and a lot of very good things happened, so that when I came into it, serious writers, there were maybe a handful of them who could support themselves by dint of their writing alone. Otherwise, you had to have a day job somewhere. Now, that's not the worst thing in the world, of course. However, it seems kind of funny that only 6 people could afford to live by what they did so very well. And a great many others were having a hard time getting published because people aren't buying serious books, and I'm talking about serious fiction here. Well, the people who write it aren't going to be making any money at all. Publishers despair of ever publishing these books profitably, and it goes right down the line. A lot of great writers would sell nothing in hardcover and never appear in paperback at all. And this was before the advent of the so-called trade paperback, which is a book-sized paperback, not a small little thing that you buy in spinner racks in grocery stores and whatnot. And so there were the best writers, in my view, in the country often weren't going into paperback at all, which I thought was idiotic, because the whole notion of expecting people to buy expensive hardcovers as opposed to waiting a year to get the same thing in a very handsome form for half price or whatever. A lot of people would say, well, maybe I'll try to remember that a year from now, but they wouldn't remember. Something needed to change, and suddenly in the mid-'80s, there was a great expansion so that the company I work for, which is part of Greater Random House then, which is now part of Greater Bertelsmann, a nice German multinational, Vintage Books was one of the distinguished trade paperback lines. However, there was not one single living writer of fiction on that list. A lot of great dead writers of fiction, and a lot of great books in all. But with some colleagues, I sort of said this is the perfect format for what seems to me the most important kind of writing, which is to say fiction that can open our eyes to experiences we've never understood, experiences very different from our own, in some cases similar to our own, but just not seen as clearly. And now, happily, of the many thousands of books that Vintage has in print, I should think a good half of those books are exactly that, contemporary fiction. That's always been my passion. It was born here, and I'm more used to hearing my writers go on than go on myself, and they, needless to say, do it rather better. But kind of on their behalf, I'm happy to be sitting up here because it is something I really found here. I even learned some bookselling lessons. There was the great Ralph Renzi, of course, who was running the shop down the road. And there was a gentleman whose name I can't recall, but he had a little store on the same side as Spring Street, but kind of tucked in behind there, a little tiny bookstore which seemed to carry only New Directions titles. And if you had the audacity to go in there and ask if he had a copy of some other book, he'd look at you as if you were the stupidest thing that ever walked down Spring Street. And that's the great thing about publishing. You get to be kind of snobbish. You get to be kind of completely willful. It's dirty work, but somebody has to do it. And the great thing is that somebody else, other than yourself, that is really doing the work. I mean, I work on behalf of these writers. I get paid by this big company. I work for a terrific publishing house. Knopf is the best I think there is. But I'm working for the writers all along because they produce what keeps me going. And if I can help those writers keep going, that's a gift that keeps going as well. And it's been my privilege to do a little bit for it. Thank you.